Okay, I don't know whether my screen's locked or that it is. It's a bit odd. Okay, so yeah, a Punjabi. Let me just get rid of my screen a little bit wider. So there you go. Okay, so Punjabi migration to Wolverhampton, 1960s to 80s, a visual journey around the city through the stories of Punjabi migrants. Now my screen's not working correctly, but there you go. I'll just have to use a different button. So yeah, I've got basically 3 points that I want to cover in the next 30, 40 minutes or so to tell you that kind of story, the tension and the polemics around Punjabi history in Wolverhampton. So first of all, I'll be looking at the tension of their formative years of migration. The second point, we'll look at the assimilation and integration of Punjabis, particularly around the work of the Punjabis around the city within the Black Country. And the third point is I want to share like a snapshot of 6 historical witnesses and share with you their untold stories about their impact that they've had within the city. And so it just represents a small snapshot amongst 40,000 strong Punjabi community within the city. And then like Jagdish said, we'll leave the questions and answers at the end. So I want to start with this statement, if you like, what a BCVA's work is and what this project is about. BCVA's work with BIPOC community deals with telling their story of their migration from their current country of origin to the UK and the tensions of those formative years living in a foreign land. As photographers, we create this work because everything that has happened to this community to them and all that they are is firmly etched into our consciousness. And who they are hasn't really mattered in the wider world. And so I continue this photographic investigation further and deeper. It's up to us to tell us their stories. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, before I start on those 3 major points, is give you a little bit of context as to about who the people are and where they're based and where they've come from, kind of thing. So first of all, just for those people who maybe come over from internationally, don't know nothing about the UK, Black Country is a small region within the West Midlands. It's not officially recognised, but it comprises of 4 major areas: Wolverhampton, Walsall, Sandwell, and Dudley. Wolverhampton is the only city within those 4, and comprises of about 250,000 people within that city. So the dilemma that we had, and why I'm speaking about the stories from the archive, is because in 2015, up to 2015, a little bit of research before we started the project called the Apna Heritage Archive, we went to the city archives and asked if there were any images that they kept that were chronicled about the city's Punjabis, which make up about 40,000 residents out of 250,000, so 15%. And I was standing behind an image bank of 30,000 images at the time. Each and every image is about has a identification marker, who, what, where, when that image was taken, from a history of about 150 years. So when I asked them, can you bring out the images from the Indians, because we're thinking about doing this project, or the Punjabis within the city, or the Sikhs, or the Hindus, whatever it might be, they said, they just came around sheepishly with a little folder with some newspaper clippings, largely around the bus driver's turban dispute, and 1 image from that, and that was it. So nothing chronicled at all. So we readdressed this by creating the Apna Heritage Archive. So we went around the city, largely predominantly through the day centres, and I have to, give credit to the women of those day centres for helping us do that work. Here they are. You can see the images here of them coming into a dedicated archive space in the most densely populated area of the city. And it was based in a Gurdwara, and they had good grace to say, yeah, we want you to reach the community, and you can have this space that we're not using within the Gurdwara to reach the community that you want to do your work with, and involve them, engage them somehow coming to the Gurdwara as well. That would be good. So as you can see from there, in the space itself, we decorated it out. We had ephemera cabinets with items. So the collection was not only just photographs that we collected, but ephemera, in other words, memorabilia, or the things that they came with, or things that meant something to them that we could showcase, the voucher letters, the albums, the work clothes, even items that they've, you know, historical reference to within the city and their own personal lives that matter to them. We have a physical collection of about 500 photographs, and we also have iPads ready so they can see the full collection that we have online as well. And on top of that, as you can see from the above image I shared, that was the space when they gave us those images. They came to donate the images and learn about more about how we scan, etc., etc. So therefore, we begin to open up started to chronicle all the pictures, as it were. So we gave them all an item, a name. We started to record exactly, you know, who, what was, where was in the image, and give each and every image a file reference. We also wanted to have ownership with the community, so we wanted to raise volunteers who could take ownership. This is Richard Lewis on the right from Dudley Archives, and he started to help to train people how to future-proof our archive. In other words, how the documents should be kept, what temperatures, how albums should be laid out, how we can future-proof the archive for the city. And this happened during various times within the year. And also, we involved the city archives within Wolverhampton in our project, that they became a partner. We had a good sense of partnerships within the city. So City Council, the art gallery where we had our findings, the Gurdwara, Guru Tegh Bahadur Gurdwara in Blakenall, the most densely populated area of the city for Punjabis. And right next to the actual center was a school, which 50% of the school was a Punjabi. In altogether, I think the school had 30 different languages. Heritage and culture wasn't taught, so we began to teach about this project and how to value their own heritage and their own culture within the confines of the project around Punjabi migration as well. So we got the children also involved in photographic activities. We got them over to the city archives to learn about strong rooms. We did various projects within the week to talk about Punjabi migration, why it's important to hold on to your heritage. We got them into groups to share about their own heritage, their own community, their own families, etc. We took portraits of them on special days to celebrate their heritage. And we also unearthed the school's archive and their history in the last 60 years that was sitting somewhere in a corner. And we bought them ephemera cabinets to host it so that in the future, stakeholders, parents, teachers can actually see their own history as well. So, yeah, what we did with the findings of the images and everything that we collected at the end of 2 years is important for us as an art organization, because art and culture is the best way I've certainly felt that people engage with the arts. So I wanted to put the findings in a proper art exhibition. So we teamed up with the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and this is just like a fly through. So you enter those doors. There's only one door to the entrance, and they come and see the interpretation, start seeing the portraits, the vitrine cases with all the objects or the albums, etc. We created a selfie studio in one corner so people can have some kind of fun with a 70s style studio mock-up. And also we actually projected the images, so 200 from each decade on one side of the wall, and people could actually sit down on the benches and begin to view those images. And we kind of selected the images which were very much, I'm not going to lie to you, we're artists, so we kind of use the most aesthetically pleasing images that people could view within our collection of 2,000 images, or 600 in total, 200 for each decade, rotating on the wall. So all the stuff that we used to scan from the slides, the boxes, the print material, passport photos, frames, whatever it might be, all the things, paraphernalia, photographic paraphernalia, people's images that we collected from, and also we presented albums, etc. So closer view of the actual rotating images. We had a file reference number under each image, which you can just about see here. So it looked like this, basically. So if you saw the word, or if you wanted to know more about the photograph, or if you thought, well, I know this street or I know the people, you could actually find out more information using the file reference. We have 3 position scrolls from each decade for each image, for each decade, along with the slides that mirror the slides that people saw, the projections rather. And then they could find out exactly who was who on the picture. And this played out later on, of course, which I'll share in a moment. But then they could also see, if they had more time, they want to scan through all the collection. It's available online. All the images were digitized. We didn't keep any of the albums. We sent them back. And then we put all the images online, and each image had a file reference number on there. So, yeah, so that's important to say, because I think all these images were latent in people's families, in people's homes, and now we've scanned them and people can log on. So in any time on our website, you can look at the analytics. People are logging in from all over the world, and largely it follows the pattern of wherever Punjabis have migrated around the world. I think there's more Punjabis migrated out the world than actually in the Punjab now. So people log on from all over the world and look at these images, and largely happens around the Western world, Australia, Canada, America, UK, etc., even India, of course, and other places as well. So we had a fantastic opening launch for the exhibition. Many people came. Glad to say predominantly the Punjabi community came and had a look. And the exhibition was acclaimed around the region. And for me, it was fascinating. I went as much often as I could and just explain some of these images. The top left, where you see the gentleman on the left, this lady here, she was looking at an image, and he kind of tapped me on the shoulder and says, my wife's not sure about this picture. I've been telling her that it is her dad, but she said, you know, she couldn't see. So I took her to the archive and pinched and zoomed on the image, and she recognized who the picture was. In the following image, this was her granddad, a picture that she'd never seen before. And she started to cry, and, you know, she said, who's taking these images? And this is the kind of thing that happened, that certain images in certain people's family album, later on people recognize them from themselves or their relatives from other people's albums. This couple came in just browsing in the gallery at the bottom right and found a picture of their wedding day that their brother, I think the lady's brother on the right, gave to us in their album. So they're happy to see that. So there's a lot of good positive things that people could recognize, and you realize how tight-knit the community is and how much they appreciated the archive, etc. The gentleman on the far left, I remember him shouting out, oh, I know him, you know. And so he used to work together with the guys within the album, and he could name them and their time. So all this kind of thing happened. And to finish off, so I think in an exhibition that took place in January and February, you know, we had the mini beast from the east and the beast from the east, and I was kind of in trepidation to how many people would actually come and see the exhibition, but it had a lot of traction, and word of mouth spread, which is the amazing thing. And I don't think the single Punjabi that hadn't seen or heard about the exhibition. So altogether, according to the Wolverhampton Art Gallery's figures, we had 27,305 visitors in that whole time. It was extended by a couple of weeks by the City Council due to its popularity, which is great. We had, you know, people from the top right here, the University of Wolverhampton History Department. We have primary schools coming along, want to know more about it. You have Dudley College's Fashion Department, photography students coming in, and some of them are here today in the meeting. Phil Brooks has brought them back in. And then also faith groups as well. This was a Khalsa Academy, and they brought all their children to see the work as well and learn more about their own heritage and history of Punjabis within the city, which is fantastic to see. And that was all done coordinated by Suman Johal at the school, all by herself, and she didn't even contact me. I just bumped into them all that day. I was so happy to see that. And of course, so that's it. That's what we did with the findings. That's the kind of reason for the archive. And of course, with the collection, what we don't have so much is the actual storytelling, which I'm trying to get to now. So I want to kind of move on to a period where, you know, who were the people, why did they come here, and how did they end up in Wolverhampton? So post the Second World War, because of the labor shortages within the UK, they were invited by the British government to make up the lack of workers within the factories and foundries and industry within the UK. So they're dotted all over the UK, but I think Wolverhampton was a hotspot because of how many migrants started to come over in the 1960s. So these pictures are all obviously notions of back at home in India that are found within the participants' albums that we've taken. So this is what they will look like, that generation, before they kind of came. So Indian workers, I think a lot of the men obviously came first, like my dad pictured here. And then a couple of years, he married my mom and brought mom here. So there was that influx and additional migration of wives who came later on. Obviously, they looked to settle later on as their stay became more permanent. And this is one of the most recent editions, which I found quite interesting, of the early years. This is Mr. Sajid Sandhu, who's a fantastic guy that I met. He's just so mild-mannered, wonderful, wonderful man. And he, at the beginning of lockdown, gave me this image. And because everyone was there in lockdown, and he was having tuberculosis, and he says, you know, why don't you scan this image, because we're all in lockdown now. And I want to tell you that I was there at this hospital with tuberculosis for 12 months. And while he was there, he's pictured next to two Pakistani gentlemen, and they're both discussing about their faiths and the difference of faiths. And he said he really appreciated that conversation, that he could contextualize, because he didn't know much about Islam at that point. And, you know, he also became an interpreter in the hospital there at Kinwood, Prestwood Chest Hospital. So I want to quickly talk about those early years, because this is a fantastic collection that we have from Mr. Salgram Das, his images that his dad actually took. He's on pictures on the right here, and this area in Wolverhampton. This is pictured in Inkerman Street and in Wolverhampton, and this is Kanta Das in the middle, Amro Das, his wife, and Mr. Salgram Das. And this area is still historically known for where most migrants end up. As you can see, it's kind of bitty and broken up. You know, it displays that kind of what the city looked like before, just before the mass migration. This picture taken right at the beginning of the 1960s. And what he did was he took these kind of amazing shots that might not mean anything to anybody else in the room, but this is my history in terms of, I remember going back into my dad's friends. They're all dressed like this on a Sunday. You know, they've had a hard week at work. You can see the hardness and stress, explained on this man's fate. And I'm so glad that he's captured this kind of imagery, because this was their day of rest on a Sunday before they have to go back in the working week as well. And this is what the kind of truth telling of that kind of time that they have. So another image, the gentleman in the middle, he lived quite close to me. I still remember him. And again, with the Das family's amazing photo. I think they were going into the pub behind them, and soon after a fight broke out. So again, it might be a blurry image, but the train in the background was the place where I used to play, and it signifies my kind of childhood. And these images are really raw, describing, you know, the railway near where they were in Heath Town, where most of the Punjabis migrated to. So one of the aspirations that you see a lot of within the archive, and the aspirations that the Punjabis had early on, was to get their house, car, the things that they were here, because largely they were here as economic migrants, not all of them. There was also a Kenyan diasporic community who came because they were forced to leave Kenya once Kenya got its independence. Just to let you know that history, they were forced to leave because they didn't want to give up their British passport, or the passport attached to the Commonwealth, and most of them ended up leaving Kenya. And a lot of that community came over to the UK. But the general ideal and aspiration for Punjabis, as you can see here from other gathered images from album collections, was to go up the social scale. So what they would do with a lot of these images were to send them back to relatives, you know, to show the progress of, you know, and settling in a foreign land. So yeah, so the early formative years were very kind of you know, interesting in terms of they've started to settle, started to have children going to school, you know, what is their future hope, and how are they going to coexist with the community around them. And so this collection here, Mr. Salgram, really gives you that kind of raw visual understanding or imagery about, you know, how they were going to settle in those formative years. Now, this image I'm going to show you is probably the most recent addition. I mean, I stumbled upon this guy. I was working on another project, Mr. Full, in Blakenhall. He was working there. And this is a picture of his dad, because he said to me, he says, without a doubt, he's 100% certain that his dad was the first Sikh in the city. So this was pictured in the early to mid 1950s. And what I gathered from this image is quite startling compared to what other images I had later on, because he seems very comfortable and they seem very comfortable with him if you look at these images. So he was a worker, he got a kind of an office job, not like a manual job, an office job, because of his high education, etc., and the need for him to work. John Thompson in Wolverhampton were like an engineering company supplying for the nuclear industry, the newly formed nuclear industry at post-war. This is one of their boilers that they kind of make, one of the things that they kind of make. So again, he's here pictured, you know, largely with the office workers, and they seem quite comfortable. Now, along with him and other Punjabis, I've heard this said quite a few times, and Mr. Fulson also bears witness that Punjabis were quite comfortable when they were living here because they were seen as a novelty. There weren't that many Indians within the Black country. And if they were here, and I don't know, I know Phil Brooks is here, from what I can remember, when he's got an uncle called Ramasamrawira, who's Sri Lankan. His dad was a doctor in the 1930s, and he was also seen as a novelty and never experienced much racism then. And this will move me on to our part of race art activism and the significant thing that happened in 1968. I think it was April 68, when in Wolverhampton, the infamous MP, Enoch Powell, gathered the media in Birmingham nearby. And he said, I'm going to make a speech. And whereas this is going to go up like a rocket, and whereas all rockets come down, this one's going to be staying up. You know, and it really kind of was an infamous speech. He got sacked soon after he made that speech. But by then he already claimed to speak for the common man. And he kind of inspired, you know, incited white working classes within the region who opposed the mass migration of Punjabis, of West Indians, because his psyche was that, you know, they don't really fit into this society. They're a different type of people. They shouldn't be here, basically. And he's a bit of a conundrum in one sense. The picture I showed you earlier of Mr. Sandhu, he was directly responsible for getting him to have his stay in Wolverhampton. And Mr. Sandhu shared with me once that Enoch said to him, he said, doesn't mind you Punjabis being here as long as you come here to work. He didn't like the notion of getting your wives over here and trying to settle down, etc., etc. So, but he definitely incited racism amongst the masses within Wolverhampton. My dad constantly, even up to the 90s, you know, always would speak about having a suitcase ready to go back home because you don't know when you could be kicked out. And we growing up didn't really fathom this with all the political things that were happening in the late 60s. The year 1968 as well was significant for the most protests in around the world at that time. I mean, I got a book on my shelf, Poetics of Resistance, which talk about all the protests that happened, recent book, and a collection of archival images. And even there, it says that 1968 was a special year for protests. Protests in the world, even now, since 2011, have been on the increase. Last year, obviously, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen protests everywhere. Things are happening in Burma. And protests are becoming more and more on the increase. And there's a lot of parallelisms that are happening now as happened then. You've had populism and Trumpism, same reasons around migration. People are afraid of this thing. And so back then, this was a very, very real kind of issue. And it was led by a Wolverhampton MP. That's a significant thing. And the whole place was inflamed because of the the situation with mass migration, as it was what Brexit is really all about. It's about who lives where in the end and who's allowed to live there. So the mass migration was also, the protest happened. I'm very glad to see this image. This is Leonard Bird's image. I bought the license for this image from Getty Images to use today. So, you know, that you can see what the thinking is. The empire's gone, but power lingers on. Fight fascism. You've got the swastika displayed everywhere, because that's a strong image in the two contrasts, because over here, it looks like springtime for Enoch and the Black Country. If you want to be a smarty, come and vote for Enoch's party. You know, it's a parody on the producers, that is, by the way, but that's what these kind of images signify for me on what's going on around that time. Now, along with this, in the Black Country, like I said, it was a hotbed for this kind of thing. It became, it came to world attention, the things that were going on. So I've highlighted in yellow, Smethwick, and another infamous politician, Pete Griffiths. So both MPs were Tory MPs at that time. And again, the mass migration, a lot of Punjabis within Smethwick, and the white populace didn't like it. There was what we call a white flight taking place in the areas that Punjabis would move into. And then the politician, Pete Griffiths, got behind the common man, inspired by Enoch Powell as well, and caused what was known to this day as the most racist election in UK history. And there was a slogan in the area called, if you want a nigger for a neighbor, vote Labour. So this really kind of inflamed tensions with the Indian community, with the West Indian community. And the Indian Workers Association, to counteract this, they kind of turned to the civil rights leader, Malcolm X, and invited him to come along into the area. So obviously the politicians didn't like the fact that he was here, but he wanted to stand by the community and, you know, voice their concerns and, you know, voice their need for rights within the community to live here and work here, just as the same as everybody else. So in that time, there's no major, there are kind of race equality laws, etc., etc. There's nothing like that. There's nothing really protecting Punjabis at work or Indians at work, West Indian communities within the city as well. So the other thing that famously happened within the city of Wolverhampton that came to worldwide attention was this young man here, Tarsem Singh Sandhu. So I think it was a bus company had a legislation that if you wanted to work with them, you had to wear a cap and you had to be clean shaved, largely look like an Indian like this rather than that. So the bus company in the area, in the region, I think there was about over 800 workers, and exactly half were Indian workers on the buses. So he kind of protested against this. He was a principled man. And he said, no, he said, I'm going to have, you know, I'm going to wear my turban and I'm not going to cut my beard. And his own relatives tried to cut his hair and shave his beard because they thought you're causing trouble for us. And this happened even within the Sikh unions. It's only because of one guy, and I may be wrong on this, you know, I'm not experts, and the experts after can share their stories a bit more. But the Sikh union themselves said some of them were waking up and said, this young man stood his ground. We're wrong. We should also wear a turban. We should support him. Others were saying, no, he's a troublemaker. He's causing more trouble for us. But until one gentleman by the name of, if I've got it right, Sohan Singh Jolly, he came along. He was like a former army member, but he was from the Kenyan diaspora, I believe. And I have heard this in the last few years from other Sikhs that, you know, it's a contentious issue, but, you know, some of the Kenyan Sikhs were the ones who stood their ground. Obviously, they migrated from India, come to Africa, and they want to, you know, let everybody know what they who they identify with as Sikhs. And it's one of the big 5 points of Sikhism that you wear a turban, you keep your beard, and they wanted to have that identification. So they had a sense of pride within Wolverhampton when they migrated here, that they said, we didn't cut our hair or shave our beard. So we were the, so other Sikhs from India tended to, you know, just go along because they had to. It's a very, very hard thing. But, you know, I'm so very glad that he stood up and, you know, for all Sikhs at that time to bear his own identity as a Sikh man. And personally, I think he looks far better. So I don't know what the problem was. He looks far better there than they do there. So, you know, and obviously this kind of was inflamed because Mr. Sohan Singh Jolly wasn't getting anywhere with the policy that he wanted to do to change the law the bus company had against Sikhs. He said, I'm going to burn myself then if this doesn't happen. And this really inflamed a lot of intentions. And soon after the sacrifice he was willing to make, you know, the law was turned upside down. And I think there was 6,000 people protested in Wolverhampton. And there was about 50,000 Sikhs within New Delhi. And it became kind of big news. So the Punjabi has had at that time huge amount of tension, huge amount of working out his identity. And of course, all communities and all ethnicities always, I think, have a varying degree of how much they assimilate and how much they integrate into this the culture around them. Here again, I'm going back to Mr. Das's image. You know, there was also this interracial relationships. We have quite a few of those images. And you kind of see how uncomfortable the lady is, the English lady, compared to the gentleman on the right. And, you know, this kind of tension of that time had, the integration was a very, very hard thing, you know. So you see in the next pictures anyway, the lady in the back of the photo, she's kind of a little bit apprehensive of having a photograph taken. She's a bit, you know, even less, you know, sorry, this one, she's less apprehensive. On the bottom left there, you can see her. She's not quite comfortable. Even when she finally has a photo taken, she's not that comfortable having a picture taken because of the obvious racial tension to know where the photos would go. And he seems quite happy to have his photo taken with the woman he loves, kind of thing. And this is their child of their union, their marriage. And I think the story is later on, many years after, and Mr. Das telling me that he was there in the room when he was told that by the father here that you know, he was already married in India. And this kind of, a lot of this happened amongst South Asian families right across the board within Pakistan Indian communities later on, as was witnessed by the film East is East or something like that. I've forgotten what it was called now, but it was a comedy in the famous film. You know, they also did a take on it. So again, you know, within the archive, you know, we have that difficult thing where, you know, people wanted to bear their identity when they first came. Mr. Just is an example. And later on, to move up the social scale, he's forced to, you know, almost not forced, but, you know, in order to move up the social scale, he has to shave his beard, you know, cut his hair, in order to progress up the ladder more than just a nominal working class worker to blue collar worker, etc., etc. And again, Mr. Jassal, who came here, he wasn't Sikh himself, but he had a beard and turban. You know, that was his identification when he first came here, but soon cut his hair, shaved his beard in order to fit into a working life for him. So I didn't want to say too much about these next images because obviously the second generation of Asians, the children of the first generations, in the 70s and the 80s, they were also polarized with British culture, and they wanted to establish their own kind of identity as second generation of British Asians. But they were empowered by the movements in Bhangra and also the new technology of VCR, video cassette recorders at that time. So your VHS tapes were shared within densely populated area. I remember them being shared amongst families, and dedicated video units and video stores were brought up, and they would play these videos, and you see all the Bollywood stars. So there was a kind of crisis culture for them, but they wanted to have an identification. So this was their new thing. You know, they inspired the new idols of Indian heroines to this new generation of love to follow them rather than the heroes in, say, Hollywood or etc. They wanted to mark their own identity. And it was also a form of escapism for the first generation of Asians from work You know, they'd love to see all these images at the weekend and talk about the films that they'd seen. So again, within the archive and the album, TV, the material objects were very, the things that people were very proud of to get, color TVs or whatever. And you can even see a Bollywood film being played in the top left-hand corner, but then they would, you know, get their children to pose in front of the TVs and send these pictures back home or themselves with them, you know, to show the sense of the social scale they're climbing within their and how they're prospering in a foreign land. And again, the identification markers within other images in the album, you know, religious or a sense of the things that the cultural icons of the day. So you see them all the time around people's homes in the kind of domestic landscape and landscape fitting of their house and of who and what they are. So generally, the whole of the images also display the kind of whole cycle of life. I would say the births, deaths, marriages, not so much deaths, but, you know, the album is that place to go to find out more about this city, and the sense of close knitness that you get through a wedding is seen through these family images, and the family strength that continues to this day. Families are so at the center and the core of Indian life and work, and, you know, everybody needs to know who their uncles and aunts and everything about that. And a wedding is often the place where everybody congregates and comes together and celebrates and that kind of thing. So within the landscape of the Black country, again, you know, there's a very kind of strong connection that the marriage largely happens within the confines of other Indians and Punjabis, etc. So yeah. Okay, so I mean, I want to move on a little bit. I can't say too much about the assimilation integration any further than that. So I really want to focus a little bit now on the work life of the Punjabis. So as I said right from the outset, the Indians were invited by the British government to work in the factories and the foundries of the Black country, and they have found affinity with obviously West Indian workers who already come here in the masses before that they did, and continued to come. So this community in some ways was seen as like the factory fodder, but they filled in the labor shortages that nobody else wanted to do at that time. And the archive in the family images also bear witness to their work and their working life as well. And largely the whole area, the whole region, you know, bear witness to this work, but there's very little said about their input into the area, about how they built up the country post-war. So these images here are taken at my mother's factory that I took when I first started photographing when I was 19. I know I don't look it now. Well, you know, these are my mom's friends that they work with at the factory. And the whole factory, I remember it being Indian. So you had whole factories that were just full of these Indian workers, 99.9% of this factory. In fact, this factory was Indian owned at the same time as well. So what I'm going to do is now work on, what are we doing for time, Jag?
It's got time. It's only 10 to 12.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so you see, I think the late 90s was the last time things started waning, when manufacturing started weakening. And, you know, you had more of an influx from Eastern Europe, and other countries started to come in. So I want to really, one of the things I had on mind was to do a virtual tour around the densely populated area of Wolverhampton and talk about some of the histories. But our archives and participants had a lot of history in this area because it was so densely populated. And I want to talk now about the race or activism around those witnesses. So there's a snapshot of how and what these Punjabis did in the time they arrived from. So I've highlighted the road, the Dudley Road, which is the main road within that densely populated area known as kind of a little India. This is what it was looked like back in the 1970s, going towards the town end. It starts from around here, if you can see my mouse. And actually where I'm circling was an Indian kind of cinema at that time, before the advent of the VCRs took them all off. This is what it kind of looks like now. It's a vast metropolis of different ethnicities, more Eastern European in recent times, and largely all businesses predominantly own shops. Indian sari suits, sweet centers, supermarkets are all still Indian owned. around the region. So the first case study, if you like, or the first subject matter is Mr. Pyara Hai. He is pictured, he's almost 90 years old in 2018. And like I said, part of the archive, we took 75 portraits. So he was one of the guys, and he's a fascinating character for me, and a fantastic family. I'm very close to one of the sons still to this day, Jim. I hope he's in here. I don't know whether he is, but he said he was going to come along. I was going to talk about his dad. So he's pictured here still at 90 years of age, working in the shop that he set up in 1961. You can see him right centrally. His daughter's just holding his leg there in the picture. And they're all having a photo taken because I think that was the only van or vehicle in the street in 1961 when he established his corner shop there. And where he's pictured now, still works in the shop, yet I think he's predominantly bought up the whole of that block and has a vast property empire as well, but continues to work in the shop. And it's a really pleasure to see him, the connotation, the community sense of spirit he has with others. Very mild-mannered man. A lot of history about him and stories you could go on forever. But one of the things I've picked out now is his relationship to this Jamaican lady, because I think she was looking, Myrtle Shakes was looking for a house to stay, and he allowed her to stay in her house, her and her sister. And she's pictured here doing a bit of babysitting of one of their children just pinned their hair. But they've had a lifelong friendship with her, and I had actually interviewed her a few months ago, just because I was fascinated by this story. And she was talking about how the children still come over to see her in Jamaica, and they were planning to come again. And she lives in Kingston now. And she was really talking about the sense of respect that the family had amongst the Jamaican community, because obviously he had supplied a lot of food as well to the Jamaican community, because obviously that community with the Indian community lived together, in the same kind of housing, in the same kind of area. So he's seen a lot of things in that area. And one of the things I remember talking to him, so he was even there when the race riots happened in the early 80s. His whole shop got petrol bombed, and the police did very, very little to do anything about the things that were happening at that time. There's a lot of indifference, and all this obviously stems from that time of that speech that was inflamed, and then the riots happened. The skinheads ran amok in the shop and tried to burn the shop up. So they had a fire back then. These are some of the images you've seen through the decades within the shop, with his wife early on again in the 60s, and a bigger van, and then his children within the same place, etc. So I think he had a huge influence, as a migrant there, as a stand-up, because obviously he must have influenced so many others. When a person sees Punjabi doing something, they also want to do it as well. And obviously the sense of business within the community and what it's done in the region, has really built up the Dudley Road itself. And he was one of the first inspirational people within the city as well who did that, and continues to do work in the shop today. Obviously, considering lockdown, I don't know whether he's going back in though. So I'll find out more about that, maybe report on that a little later on. So yeah, that's Mr. Pyara Hai. So I want to move on to Mrs. Jane now. She's in her late 90s. I haven't seen her for a while. Her husband passed away recently. And both her and her husband came here in the early 60s, and I think they were living 15 people in a room, etc. And they were both one of the first teachers within Wolverhampton. So here's a picture of her back in 1969, 1970, and her husband working within the school setting or having the school photo taken. And she's a very amenable person. If you meet her, the butter doesn't melt in her mouth away. She's a very gentle person. She was also inspirational because the Jains, I didn't know much about the Jain religion at all till I met her, but apparently she actually helped spread Jainism right through the UK, because she felt that, her and husband felt that the identification of Jainism is going, nobody's really doing anything about it or worshipping at a certain place. So they were instrumental right throughout the country themselves into establishing that religion again amongst the Jain people. And this was a page that really fascinated me when I first saw it, particularly that picture of her at school. And I began to inquire more about this photo, because the more I look into this picture, you can see the body language. This lady is trying to move towards the headmistress here, and she seems quite a little bit aloof, and that's in contrast to, say, Mr. Full's image I showed you, who worked in the factory in Wolverhampton. He looked more comfortable than she did. But again, this stems from the speech, and what happened, well, her time at Bingley School in Wolverhampton, she had an issue with the head teacher eventually, because she noticed more and more that the headmistress was very offish and did not like any of the Black or Asian kids within the school. So she raised it as an issue, and she also got targeted, she felt, because of that. And I find that shocking when I'm talking to her, because like I said, she's like a gentle lamb, the way she speaks and demeanor. She also is a leader within the community, because she set up a day center for all the Punjabis within the city, within a one day center, and she runs the whole thing even into her 90s very, very well. So I was shocked to hear that, but she said, yeah, she actually went into the office one day and she said to the teacher, the head teacher, said, either you're going to sack me or I'm going to resign today, because I've had enough in the way your treatment is around with Asians. So because of certain race relations, there were different acts that were happening early on, 60s and 70s. She felt that they weren't observing the Race Relations Act, and so she said she's trying to kick up a fuss at the civic centre to say, look, you need to get involved here. And they really were up in arms when this happened. So instead of sacking her or letting her resign, they moved her on to another school here off the Dudley Road, which is far more multicultural. And I know that, I don't know, Mr. Harrison was telling me a story that she actually taught him in that school. So she was moved there, and she worked there until the day she retired. So she was a lot happier there. But that was quite a fascinating history in her early years of working life. This is Mr. Anup Gurwal, I want to introduce you to. Sitting here with this picture when he was a lot younger. I've got more of a scan that I made from his family album. He looks somewhat like the young man with the turban here when he first arrived to Wolverhampton. His dad sends him over here first before he actually gets here, and he's living with one of his uncles near the Molyneux Stadium. A lot of the Asians moved there, and he's kind of a success story within the city in the early 80s, but through a lot of opposition and tumult. But he kind of witnesses that he never experienced what he felt was extreme racism, etc., early on at all. But he made himself a very successful businessman from a business in Blakenhall. And I want to use this example because the factory, I think Norton Motorcycles, was where a lot of the workers got up in support and protested along with Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. A lot of them were the white working class. So he has a factory there. This was the actual Norton Motorcycles at that time, off Marston Road, position where I showed you the map. Sorry, I'm moving around rapidly. That cycle is where that red spot is there, and then Villiers Engineering Works is here, and this is what the building looks like now. So along with the motorcycling, so I thought I'd just share this image over here, because you can see where in the yellow I've highlighted Sunbeam Street, and in the right at the bottom you can see another bit of red building there. That's where our archive is based today, but it was originally the Sunbeam factory. So that's the history and the heritage within the city. That car there broke the land speed record back in the day, and Sunbeam Motors, Norton Keynes, you can see that kind of vehicle industry up to today. You have Jaguar Land Rover still based, the historical connection to the motor industry. So in that space where he worked, he actually started making quilts, and the quality of quilts he was producing became to such prominence that other big companies were interested in it. So he had to quickly arrange for a go-between. He happened to be a white worker, the face of the business, if you like, to be able to do business. And the people that he was starting to do business with were Barber, Burberry, Aquascutum. Those kind of companies were interested in it and bought his quilts. So he remembers the day he had to sharply get a new manager in, and he had to go down because he didn't feel he would be accepted by Barber as soon as they saw him as an Indian man. So he got this very cleverly, you know, set up an English guy as a face of his business. He said he traveled on a truck with a load of quilt over to Barber in London and came home with a £10,000 check. So that's how he started the success of his business. He lives in a big house now in Spring Hill, Wolverhampton. So he's done very, very well for himself, and talks about the entrepreneurship that still exists among the Indians today in business, and the success and the impact they've had within the city. But that largely, again, is a very untold story, which we'll want to try and tell. This gentleman now here that you see with his wife is Bishan Das. Bishan Das was one of the first, probably the first ever Indian mayor within the city. So the picture that you see in the background is a very prominent figure in Indian history, modern history, Dr. Ambedkar, and he labels himself as an Ambedkarite, which is a follower of Ambedkar, is seen as a guru. And he was a bastion. He was around at the same time as Gandhi, and those were his contemporaries. And he was a bastion for racial equality for all people in India. So in India, you have the horrors of what they deem as the caste system. You know, I have to admit, you know, my family were what was called high class caste, but my dad would never speak of it to me because he was orphaned when he was young, and none of his high class Hindu families looked after him. They put him in an orphanage. So he didn't see any basis or worth in any kind of caste system himself. But Mr. Baines also talks about the kind of inequality he faced even amongst his own community when he first lived here, because he said the houses that he went in, he could see in English houses it were written no blacks, which meant blacks and brown people, you know, no Irish, no dogs. But he said he was in an Indian lady's house, and because when she found out what caste he was, she kicked him out of the house, which is kind of fascinating on the other side. And so he worked along with the Indian Workers Association, various other associations, various unions. In the unions, he always tried to bring up Indian people's rights when he was working as a normal, before he went into blue collar job, white collar job, and then eventually as a mayor. He, in the early days, tried to voice his concerns of inequality and race relations within those groups. So he kind of was disenfranchised, I think, and with the Indian Workers Association because, you know, and other groups, even whether it was a Sikh union or an Indian union or whatever it might be, you know, he found there's too much infighting going on, and opposition to him as well, as to he felt there was a certain amount of jealousy as to why he was moving higher up the ladder in the council and eventually became the mayor of the city. But it is through, I want to read something of his, if I can do, that you can understand the kind of ethos he had and the impact that he was trying to establish within the city. So I think this is one of his speeches he made afterwards about his Indian roots, and said, secondly, and most importantly, I shall remember my political and moral beliefs without which a person in public life is arid. The influences on my life have been many. The teachings of my guru, Dr. Ambedkar, who struggled so hard for the poor and deprived of people of India, the struggle of the trade union movement, and the policies of the Labour Party, all these seem to point in the same direction, the promotion of equality, liberty, and fraternity. My wife, my family, and I shall be delighted to promote these ideals in Wolverhampton over the next year. So that's his inauguration speech that he makes, and his ethos for wanting change. And obviously this was a big thing given the Rivers of Blood speech at that time, and that he should have such a high position as Indian. And he opened the door for many other Indian mayors after that as well. And his wife was very much a person within the mayoral election, whatever the word is trying to look at, position that they held, that she was very warm and approachable, and she opened a lot of doors for him to speak in other areas, and people really kind of gelled to her as well, warmed to her in that kind of position that he had. So he came over in the 70s, like many Indians. I just brought this in. Was going to cut this out, but you can see it now. It's a voucher. He got a voucher to come here. This is a picture of him when he was actually mayor of the city of Wolverhampton. That's his wife. Okay, so I'm going to start coming into the end now. So you've been very patient. Thank you for staying with it. So the next person I'm going to introduce you to from the archive is Mr. Gurdev Rai. Fascinating guy. This was taken outside the Goodyear factory, a prominent factory in Wolverhampton for many Asian workers and for the whole city, established in 1929. December was the first time they made a first tire. When this picture is taken, it's the last day of the factory's opening. It's going to close. And like a lot of families in Wolverhampton, generations work together. He stood there in the freezing cold. I couldn't take the cold because it's really, really cold, and I was a coward because he stood there, must have been 2 hours before the workers actually came out. Emotional moment where he's going to greet his son. He got him the job in 1980 as he left the workplace. So that was the day of the closure. That's what kind of it looked like back in the entrance where he's standing. The Goodyear Dunlop factory, late in probably early 2000s, that image was taken. That was the famous chimney of the factory. And obviously it was celebrated with the Goodyear blimp and the airship they used to fly, and they used to have these celebration and events. And the workers really kind of well paid, one of the best paid factory jobs within the city. And a lot of people aspired to work in that factory. So this blimp is flying over the Molyneux Stadium in Wolverhampton. There you are, you see him pictured, and his special role there was in the 60s, pictured there, was he was the first ever Indian on the racing car division. And all these stories, if you look at any kind of history, if you Google it, you'll always see predominantly the white story being told around Goodyear and the white workers being photographed, as opposed to any of the Asian, which was a strong condition along with West Indians and Indians in the factory. Very few pictures are taken like this. This is courtesy, by the way, of Derek Peters' collection. He gave me the rights to use that picture. And then on the left, you see him pictured now. And this is the fascinating point, that he's having stuff. This is Jackie Stewart, who's like Lewis Hamilton today. He's pictured here with Gurdev. And Gurdev was used quite a lot. He looked like a young Robert De Niro, to be honest with you. And he was pictured quite a lot in all their brochures and everything else. Because when the stars used to come to the factory to thank the workers, they'd go to Gurdev. And Jackie Brabham on the right is actually on the back end of this. He's actually written here to Gurdev. Jackie Brabham, because your tires, you made me, had won the Spanish Grand Prix 1977 or whatever it was. So he had that history. And again, these kind of stories haven't been told of that community. I photographed his top here, his work top that he still had with him. Unfortunately, we lost him last year, the beginning of last year, just before COVID. He passed away. So another lady, phenomenal lady, phenomenally talented woman, she showed me some of her artworks, Rugveer Kaur, sorry, not Rugveer Kaur, Rawinder Kaur. I'm taking a picture of her there, what she looks like now, in one of the factories she worked across in Wednesbury, all over the Black Country. But she speaks of that tenacious womanly kind of spirit where she worked part-time, looked after the kids part-time, became a homemaker in between, but also wanting to support the family in terms of finances, etc. Here she is pictured in 1989, December. And I'm glad she kind of take the next kind of following pictures as well with her friends around the workplace where she works. So this was like a Christmas party in 1989 to 20 December 89. There's a picture, one of those dated cameras that you had, which are great now for telling you the exact time when the picture was taken, which is kind of important now. And so there's a disparity between connections between Asian workers and white workers because of language differences, etc. They have their pictures taken, but she said they stayed away from each other because of language and cultural barriers. They never used to mix, and this is right up until the early 90s with the white working classes, etc. So again, Asian workers, Indian women workers made, so there's so many of these textile factories within dotted around the black country that don't exist now. Many of the Asian workers worked piecework, working at home and at work places like this, making sewing clothes and costumes. This doesn't exist anymore anywhere in Wolverhampton, but it's full of the Asian workers, the Asian ladies, etc., etc. So I'm gonna stop talking. It's in conclusion. What is the end of the matter? I think this speech that what was made by Enoch Powell and the way the Indians have had impact into the society. Mr. Hare is a great witness, because he said to me, and I want to use his quote, is regardless of what that speech is, it hasn't really come true, the rivers of blood, because the city is very multi-ethnic, multicultural, and lives in quite a good harmony up until this day. But the impact on the Punjabis, the untold stories, is that the Punjabis, as he would told me, this is what his words were. He says, without a doubt, he says, I came in the 50s and this whole country was bitty and broken up. He describes the time where he had to travel ages, until he saw someone taking him to a house where there's a colored